Good morning. Welcome to the beautiful campus of Midwestern State University. We're glad you're here this morning. We've got a great presentation for you. So, I think everyone in the room is aware of the economic development planning that's going on. We're in the process of developing a new strategy for growth for Wichita Falls. And next week we kick that off with several focus groups, one-on-one interviews, and the first steering committee meeting with our consultant, Market Street Services. And Dick Bundy and I have been talking for a while, and Darren Liker as well, about bringing in Dr. Perryman. It's been a while since he's been here. We want to bring him back to talk about what's been going on in Wichita Falls and where he sees us going in the future. And because of our planning that we're about to get started with, we thought this week would be a great time to do that. So what we hear today will be fresh in everyone's minds. And so I'm going to introduce Dr. Perryman. And usually I don't like to read bios, but I want you to hear some of this. Dr. Ray Perryman is president and CEO of the Perryman Group out of Waco. It's an economic research and analysis firm. He holds a BS in mathematics from Baylor, a PhD in economics from Rice, and he always felt that BS would have somehow been more appropriate for economics, and has spent his life proving it. He took his first economics course on a coin flip between economics and psychology. If it had gone the other way, there might have been some really messed up people in this world. In addition to his earned degrees, Dr. Perryman has received an honorary doctorate from the International Institute for Advanced Studies. After that one, he told his kids they had to start calling him Dr. Doctor. They preferred dork, dweeb, nerd, geek, and loser on a good day. Dr. Perryman has held numerous academic positions in his career, including 10 years as the Herman Brown Professor of Economics and 5 years as Business Economist in Residence at Southern Methodist University. He's authored several books and more than 400 academic papers, and has served as president of both Southwestern Economic Association and Southwestern Society of Economists. He also lives in Odessa while working in Waco, is the father of 5 young Texans between 28 and 34, although some temporarily reside elsewhere, and he's a grandfather of 3. He gets lost on his own block, even though he lives on a circle, and once ran one of his cars into the other one. His current academic roles include Senior Research Fellow of the IC2 Institute at the University of Texas, an Institute Distinguished Professor of Economic Theory and Method at the International Institute for Advanced Studies. He's authored more than 2,000 trade articles, publishes a subscription forecasting service. He's got a syndicated newspaper column, daily radio commentary. He appears on NPR on a regular basis. In other words, he is an obsessive-compulsive workaholic. We'll skip down to the end here, but you ought to read the rest of this when you get a chance. Some of his most gratifying work has actually been in the field of economic development. He has played a key role in location projects that have created thousands of jobs. Most recently, he was selected 2012 Texan of the Year by the Texas Legislative Conference, received the 2013 Baylor University Distinguished Service Medal, and the 2016 Cesar Chavez Legacy Award for his humanitarian efforts. How about a warm round of applause for Dr. Ray Perryman.
It's a pleasure to be here today and visit with you. It has been a while since I've been up here. Good to see my friend David Farrenby. David and I have been friends for a very long time. His parents and I were good friends as well. And I will have to say, I don't try to stay out of politics. I don't do very well, but I try to stay out of politics. But I will say that when he represented you in Austin, he was one of the best representatives we had down there because he had the good sense to work with people and try to get something done. And because we need him, I wish you were still there. Because you're my friend, I'm so glad you're not. Okay, but it's great to be here. And I'm going to start very briefly. I don't want to take a lot of your time, but I'm going to, despite all the stuff that Henry said about me, I'm going to add one thing to my bio, okay? Because this one really meant something to me. I mean, when you do what I do, you get a lot of awards and stuff, and all that's nice. But occasionally you get one that really means something to you. And a couple of years ago, my little high school, I grew up over in rural East Texas, a little town called Lindale. It has about 5,000 people now. It had about 1,000 then. It became pretty successful after I left. But anyway, they started a Distinguished Alumni Award at the school district, and they were kind enough to give that to me. And that meant something to me, to go back to my high school and see all that. And I spent a couple of days and saw a bunch of old friends. And my wife asked me what it was like to grow up in a town that small. And I told her it was great. You know, I loved it. Nobody locked their doors. Everybody knew you could do whatever you wanted to do. And she said, well, what were the challenges of a town that small? And I said, we didn't have any challenges, man. It was nice. And she said, well, there had to be some problems in a town that small. So I thought, okay, I got to think of something here. So I thought about it, and I said, well, there was this one thing. I said, you know, we were so small that we had to take driver's education and sex education in the same car. And she thought about that for a minute, and she said, you know, Ray, that makes perfect sense. You can't drive either. So just want you to know how much respect I get at home, okay? Anyway, I've been asked to talk about economic development and your community and the economic development process and that sort of thing this morning. I guess I'll start with a little bit of framework. I don't want to spend, usually when I give these kind of talks, I spend a lot of time on the economic outlook for the U.S. and Texas and all that kind of stuff. But I want to do just a few minutes of that because obviously whatever economic development you do is going to be within that framework. How much you can grow is going to be a function of how well the country does and how well the state does and how you can compete for some slice of that. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, and so I'll keep it very brief. But basically, and it's not really all that exciting right now. The U.S. economy has been growing fairly slowly for the last 2 or 3 years. And I think it's going to keep growing fairly slowly for the next 2 or 3 years. I don't see anything out there that's likely to cause a major recession. There's some really stupid stuff we could do to cause one. But I don't think we will. And that's how most recessions happen. People think it's a business cycle and all that. And there is a business cycle, and there are reasons that companies go up and down that have to do with investment cycles and all kinds of things. But our country's gotten so complex that not all industries do that at the same time anymore. So it's very rare you have a recession that's because everything just kind of went bad all at once. Normally, when you have a recession these days, it's because we did something stupid. If you think about the last two, you'll know what I'm talking about. Let's think about the last one for just a second here. Here's how the last one happened. Some people looked around, they saw a guy over here somewhere, and they said, look at him. He doesn't have a job, not very much education, lazy, mama doesn't like him, mean to his dog, he kind of shiftless, doesn't have anything going on in his life. What he needs is a house. And we're going to figure out a way to get him a house. And it doesn't matter that he doesn't have little things like a job and income and those kinds of things. We're going to find a house for him. And we did that for everybody we could find. The financial market decided, let's put everybody in a house we can possibly put in a house and then worry about how they'll pay for it in 3 or 4 years. And then they rolled up all those stupid mortgages and put them in bonds. And then they said, okay, we've given all the deadbeats we can find houses and people still want more bonds, so we can write derivatives on these bonds. Now, what a derivative is, it sounds complicated. It's a complicated financial term. It's a side bet, okay? It's a side bet. So you don't own the mortgages, but you're betting on the mortgages paying off. Just like if you ever go to the track and you bet on a horse. You don't own the horse, but you get paid based on how the horse performs. You basically bought a derivative on the horse. I mean, that's all a derivative is. So not only did we have all these bad mortgages, but we had all these side bets on them. So if you had a house here in Wichita Falls that was $50,000 underwater, and you sell 100 derivatives on it, you created $5 million in economic losses from that one house. And we did that in spades, and man, we had us a humdinger of recession, worst one we've had since the Depression. The one before that, we did something else stupid. It was very similar, but this time it was companies. We said, let's look at this company over here, and let's really analyze it very carefully. Doesn't have any profits, never has. Doesn't really have a very good business plan. In fact, come to think of it, it's never had any revenue. It's burned through all its early investors' cash like crazy. But you know what? Its last name is .com. So it's got to be worth 10, 15, 20 billion dollars. And we put these things on the market that had absolutely no way of ever making any money, and it all crashed, and we had a recession. So usually it's when we do something like that. And we're doing stupid stuff now, but nothing that stupid. But the economy's been recovering now for a long time. We don't remember a lot of it because it was so slow at the beginning. But the economy's been recovering like 8 years now. It's been in a very, very long recovery cycle, one of the longest in history. And so a lot of people are saying, well, it's been so long we might have a recession. You're starting to see that a lot on the financial press. And I have to tell you, in this day and age, recoveries don't die of old age. It takes something to knock us off the track. And there are clearly things that could knock us off the track. I mean, the biggest threat we probably have right now is something cyber. Shut down the power grid, shut down the financial system, shut down the transportation system. I mean, there are things that could happen that can knock us off the path, there's no question. But you don't wake up in the morning thinking that's the most likely outcome for that day. And so as a result, we should just kind of rock along like this for a while longer. There are a lot of policy issues, a lot of uncertainty out there right now. You all know that. We're kind of in a very weird time. But at the end of the day, that stuff kind of gets colored inside the lines, despite all the craziness. And unless we do some really stupid things, we should be fine for a few years. The state of Texas has had a fairly interesting run lately. And you know, because you still have some level of dependence on the oil industry around here, not as much as you had at one time. So you got to see it in spades. But basically, we had this huge boom with the fracking thing. Then we had a bust, and now we're coming back some. And the interesting thing about this one is we really did very well during this recession, this last time around with the oil industry. In fact, you could argue it even wasn't a recession in Texas, because if you stop and look at it, if you go back to 1982, 1981, the last time we had a big oil boom followed by a big oil bust. At the peak of that, when there were 305,000 people working in the energy industry in Texas. This time at the peak, there were 305,000 people working out in the oil fields in Texas and the related services. So exactly, the oil boomed exactly the same amount in terms of people. And then right after that, prices fell the same percentage. Rig count fell the same percentage. Oil and gas employment fell the same percentage as it fell in the 80s. But in the 80s, we lost over 250,000 jobs in Texas when that happened. This time around, we only gained 160,000 the first year and 200,000 the second year. And now we're back on a pace to gain about 300,000 again. So it's pretty remarkable when you think about it. I mean, we were gaining 400,000 when the oil boom was going like crazy. So we definitely had a big slowdown. But it's amazing that we managed to continue to progress and grow and have some positive growth despite our biggest industry taking it on the chin as bad as it did in the 80s. We grow a little faster than the country on average. We fell behind, obviously, during this oil thing. We've caught back up and passed it again, and I think we'll continue to see that because we have a lot of things going for us in Texas. Number one, I think the oil industry has quite a bit of future, and if I were spending more time, I could spend an hour on that. But beyond that, our technology industries are growing. Our health sector, which is very big in this area, is growing very rapidly, health and biosciences. And there's a lot of positive things going on in the state right now. Again, we could do some things to mess it up. And the biggest thing we can do to mess it up is not educate this next generation of kids. That's the biggest thing we can do to mess it up. But nonetheless, at least for the near term, I think we'll continue to see Texas do reasonably well. Not oil boom well, but a lot better than we did the past couple of years. So I'll stop it at that. I'll take questions at the end. If y'all want to talk about some of that in more detail, it's fine. But I want to get to economic development and to your area. And first of all, let me talk about economic development a little bit. About, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, the International Economic Development Council, which is a kind of group of economic developers around the world, asked me to put together a thing to kind of describe how economic development really works and try to boil it down to just a few things. And that's kind of a tall order, but I managed to do it, and I want to share a little bit of it with you because when you stop and think about it, I think it's just a good way to frame everything as you go into your focus groups and you're thinking about the future of your community and that sort of thing. I think this would be a pretty good way to look at it. I said, think about it like a market. And it's a market for prosperity. Okay? And in this market, you are you're one side of the equation, on the supply and demand equation. You're a community, and you want people to come in. On the other side are companies, and they want to come to the best place that they can come. Okay? And if you just look at it that way and say, okay, what do both sides want? And again, that's part of what the process you will go through in the next few weeks is determining what you want. But I suspect most of you have a pretty good idea. You'd like to have some growth. You'd like to have some good jobs, well-paying jobs that would keep the next generation of people here and provide opportunities for them. Jobs that are clean and things that would help build your community. You'd like to see some plants that put some capital in the ground and build your tax base up, your business tax base up. So, I mean, those are the kinds of things. I mean, I think a lot of people want quality of life, good, solid growth, that type of thing. And that's what you want. What the companies want is to maximize shareholder value. That's what they get paid to do, is maximize shareholder value. And so they're going to go wherever they think they can get the best return on the dollars they invest going forward. Now, used to, that wasn't always the case, I'll be honest with you. There was a point in time, and it wasn't that long ago, when I first started doing economic development 30, 35 years ago, this was fairly common. That might be, well, we want to maximize profit, but the CEO also wants to be close to his grandkids. And you'd have stuff like that happen. Or, yeah, we want to maximize profit, but the top two guys really like to fish. There's a great lake over here, okay? You don't get any of that anymore. And there's a reason why you don't get it, and that is shareholder activism. We have a very different situation than we used to have. And you may think I'm going all over the map, but this is what you need to think about when you're thinking about economic development. Today we have 24-hour financial news. We have online, we can get more than that. We have very active shareholders. We have rules now to let the shareholders come in and say, yeah, we don't like what you're doing. We're going to put some people on your board and change things. Okay? And we have an incentive structure for corporate executives that's almost entirely based on performance. When you see these CEOs that make $20 million a year, or 30 or 100 or something, their salary was about $1 million. And the rest of it was bonuses and stock options they were able to cash in, or restricted stock they were given that the value came into play and they invested. Very little of it is salary. They're not working for their salary. They're working for all the stuff on top of the salary, and all that's based on performance. And now they even have these groups that come in and tell them, these shareholder activist groups have associations that come in and tell them how well they're performing. And of course, when you got a group that comes in from the outside and tells you how well you're doing, they want something easy. So they say shareholder value. That's it. That's the whole ball game. And so, and I think it has some good traits to it, because that is ultimately what corporations are trying to do. That is their duty. They have a fiduciary responsibility to the folks that put up the money. But sometimes that can cause you to make a decision that's maybe more short-term focused than long-term focused. But here's what it means in terms of economic development. It means no matter how much the folks like you, and no matter how much they would kind of like to be here, if you don't have the workforce they need, they absolutely cannot come, period. If you don't have whatever material supply chains they need around you and access to the type of transportation they need, they absolutely cannot come. And another one, and this one gets controversial, but I know you have the programs here to let you deal with it. You better be ready to put some incentives on the table. And there's a lot of debate back and forth. The legislature had a big debate about it this session. Do you need incentives? Do you not need incentives? I'm sure there's disagreement in this room. And I can tell you, back in way back in another life, I was a fairly decent high school debater back in my day. And the thing in high school debate was you took one side one round, another side the next round, so you had to learn both sides of the argument very convincingly. I think I can take either side of the incentives debate and beat most people. I can make a very good case for them, and I can make a very good case against them. And so anybody has any of those kind of opinions, I'm sure I've heard them and I can sympathize with them and that sort of thing. The problem is, when you get to the real world where this stuff takes place, you have to have them. I mean, in theory, I would love to get rid of all the incentives in the world and then let everybody compete on a straight up fair basis. If you did that, this area would do just fine. But there's something very important about what I just said. Get rid of them everywhere in the world. Because if anybody has them, everybody's going to have them. And I know that sounds crazy, but here's how the process works. Basically, again, they're looking for the workforce they need, the infrastructure they need, whether it's communications infrastructure, technology infrastructure, or rail, or highway access, or whatever they need to make it work. They're looking for raw materials. They're looking for different things they have to have for the company. And there's going to be a bunch of places that can do that. We're going to have a lot of places that can get them what they need. Get the workforce, get the things. Normally there's 4 or 5 decent finalists in every site selection process. And then it comes down to, and again, think about these guys' minds. They're thinking, we got to maximize shareholder value. We kind of got this to a draw at this point. So what's going to make the difference? And it goes a step further. Nowadays, their shareholders watch that stuff. And if they have 2 or 3 places that are about equal and one of them offers a big incentive package and they don't take it, they're going to have those shareholders on their back. And they may get another director put in there, an activist director, and he may kick them all out. And they lose those bonuses and those stock options and that sort of thing. So there's that piece of it. It's the constant coverage of it. And then there's the other piece of it, consultants. And bless our hearts, we could screw up an anvil. I mean, we can mess up anything. But there's a big group of companies that are site selection consultants. They help companies find sites. We do a little bit of that. We don't market that, but occasionally a company just knows we have a lot of stuff and asks us to do it. We've done some very big ones over the years. But in the marketing of these services, what do you think the site selection consultants say to their clients? They say, we got the last guy so much money in incentives. X dollars per job, or some other measure, X dollars per dollar of capital investment, or whatever it was. We delivered a lot of incentives, and they market themselves by how much they get in incentives. And that screws up the process, because then they have a bias toward places that have incentives. And if you're one of those 4 or 5 places that would work, and you don't put anything on the table, they're never going to see you. Because they don't want to go to their next client and say, boy, we got these other people in just exactly the right place. Well, how much money did you get them? Well, we didn't get any money, but we got them in exactly the right place. Well, your competitor over here got their last guy $10 million. And that's the process and how it takes place. Because they market themselves based on incentives, that's a ticket to the dance. And I'm not saying it's a good system. I'm saying it's a system that we have to work in. Like I say, if you could get rid of all this stuff, that'd be great and wonderful. But we're really in a situation now, and you have them, and you've used them effectively here, and that's good. So, I just want to emphasize that you're thinking about the future, being able to leverage those kinds of things is important. Now, it's not the only thing in town. Again, it's not. Nobody has ever come to a location only because of incentives. If you don't have the workforce, if you don't have those other things, they can't come. I mean, they can't move to a place where they can't make their product and sell it at a competitive price. They can't do it. Okay, so I like to use sports analogies a lot, and it's kind of like in football. All those other things which are very important: the education, infrastructure, job training, materials, whatever they need. All of that other stuff's required to get you in the red zone, to get you inside the 20. Okay. Once you're inside the 20, if you want to score, that's where the incentives come in. It's the second piece, and not even the most important piece, but a critical piece. And so just keep that in mind as you're thinking about that. Now, a couple of the things I've said along the way here kind of lead to a couple of other things, and then I want to talk about your area a little bit as well. And I'm going to try to keep this part of it as short as possible so we can have a conversation. And I told Henry I don't have any place I have to be at 10 o'clock or anything, so if y'all want to go a little bit over time, that's fine with me. If we're having a good conversation, but it brings up a few other points to think about when you start thinking about how do I want my community to grow, what kind of economic development do I need, and that sort of thing. When you start thinking about those things, one thing it says is, don't even try to compete for stuff you're not going to get. Okay, and a lot of communities make this mistake. They'll wake up one day and say, we want to be a high-tech engineering community. That's great. How do your engineers compare with San Diego, Silicon Valley, Austin, Atlanta, and Research Triangle Park in Massachusetts? How are you doing on that? How are you doing competing with University of Texas and Stanford and Harvard and MIT? How are you doing on that? And if the answer is, well, not quite so well, then there's no point in trying to get those folks. They're not going to come to you're not going to get them. And the frustrating thing about economic development is what second place gets you is a fruit basket. Okay? It's not like they say, well, okay, we like them, we like y'all, and they were a little bit better, so we'll put 600 jobs over here and 400 jobs over there. That's not how they do it. They put 1,000 jobs in first place. In second place, if you're nice to them and they liked you, they'll send you a real nice note and say, man, y'all are great people, we love you, we'll look at you in the future, here's a nice fruit basket for your efforts. And or maybe a Yeti cup these days. They give away a lot of Yeti cups these days. But something like that. You're going to get the nice gift that says we really appreciate being here. Last night, Harry gave me some pecans that were local with butter and honey and stuff on them. Man, I ate near the whole sack last night. That was a good. You did well. Okay, you did very well. But and the guy that drives my van, he ate his whole sack too. So you did very well on that one. But anyway, so. It's the kind of thing where, and the other thing is, you're not going to win every time. You have to be out there competing and trying, and you're not going to win every time. So that's another, and you have to accept that. The other thing you have to accept, and this is a really tough one. Whole bunch of economic development folks have been fired over this one over the years, and I feel sorry for them. you don't get it right every time. If a company comes in here and says, we're going to create X number of jobs, we're going to invest this much money, we want this much in incentives, you run the numbers, and it all looks like a good deal, and it's all flanged up real well, and you say, okay, that's great, that's wonderful. Okay, we'll do that. And then a year later, they lose that government contract that was providing all the money for that. Or a company in China turns out can do what they do for 50% of the cost, and they lose all their customers. Those things happen. You know, we don't have perfect foresight. So even when you do it and do your homework and do it very well, it won't always work out well. And I hate that because every session when we get into Austin and start talking about it, that's the first thing they do is pull out the 2 or 3 that in the last 2 years something happened. Didn't go like it was supposed to. And I keep telling them, yeah, next time we're going to have 3 or 4 more. You know, that's how the process works. And you just have to accept that. It's not a perfect foresight game. You're trying to forecast what's going to happen in the future with a whole lot of uncertainty out there that we don't know about. And sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you'll think they're going to employ 400 and they'll employ 800. That happens too. It happens in both directions, but you never hear about those. What you hear about is the one that just didn't work out like it was supposed to. There's a very good example not far from here in the Metroplex a few years ago with a big aerospace company. That kind of deal, put a whole big package together, all was working great, and the Defense Department canceled that program. And that was that. You know, those things happen, and you can't do anything about it. So that's another piece of it, is just to kind of understand what you're dealing with. What you're trying to do, I mean, you're taking some assets. You have voted as a community, and think about this for a minute. You have voted as a community. We want to tax ourselves. We think it is so important for this community to do well that we have decided we want to give the government some money. Out of every dollar we spend here, we want the government to get some money in order to put it in a pot to help us do better. And you have both pots. You have the 4A pot and the 4B pot. And there's a lot of history behind those, but that's not important right now. but you have said as a community, we want to invest in ourselves. We want to build our future. With that comes responsibility to use that money in a very, very responsible manner. But what that doesn't mean is you're always going to get it right. You're just not. You know. So all that's just kind of framework and background for economic development. The other thing I will say about the process is, as you're going through it and looking at it and deciding what you want to try to do and target, the kind of corollary to the whole thing about don't try to be Austin, you know, that sort of thing, is build from your strengths. You know, start out with, okay, we have this university here, and they're training some awfully good folks. We have a community college down the road, and they're training some awfully good folks that can do some things. You know, what can they do, and what can we leverage, and what could they do in the future if we supported them that would help us in that? What kind of workforce are we getting here? What kind of companies do we have here today? That's a very important question. And you're fortunate here, it's gone down a lot. In fact, it's, you know, like most manufacturing, the employment side of it's taken on the chin the last few years, and you've had some setbacks there. But you still have a strong manufacturing base for a town this size. And look at that and say, okay, what do those folks make? Okay, well, who are their suppliers? Who are their customers? Because those are good prospects. Because you immediately have saved them some transportation costs if they move close by. Chances are some of the labor, there's kind of crossover in the labor market. So you may have helped them there. So I mean, that's just a place to look. You know, but it's all about building from your strengths. And then the other thing you need to look at when you're looking at industry, not only just what you're doing now, because obviously part of this process is figure out some new stuff to do, because we're not real happy with how we've done the last few years. Let's figure out some new stuff to do. But the other piece about that is when you're doing that, make sure that the industry is not only a fit, but that it's growing. And again, these are just things I've seen communities do, find a great fit for themselves, but in an industry that's losing jobs every year. Why do you want to do that? You're going to be competing for a smaller and smaller and smaller pie every year, and then competition is going to get more intense for all the other places trying to get that little piece of pie, and there's not going to be much to get. And you know, and there are plenty of industries that are expanding, and the emerging growth industries, and a lot of them are technology oriented, but a lot of them are not, and a lot of them are, but you wouldn't think they are. The real definition of a high-tech industry that's most commonly used is if they spend more than twice the national average on research and development as a percentage of their total revenue. That's a high-tech company. They're investing in new technologies to try to grow their industry and do new things in the future. Well, if you look at it that way, which is the common definition, man, the oil and gas industry is high-tech. Agriculture is high-tech. There's a whole lot of stuff that's high-tech when you start looking at it from that framework. So, all that to say, there's just a lot of things to think about out there. And the other, one more piece of that type of advice before I go on is always, and I'm sure you do this now, but do your homework. There's a real temptation, particularly if you hadn't had, and y'all have had a few lately, a few good programs, but if you hadn't had one in a few years, there's a real temptation to like, man, we got to get a win here. They want a little more money than we think it's worth. We got to get a win here. Nah. Always try to make it available on a cost-benefit basis and say, does it make sense for us to do this? Now, if they ask for too much, you don't need them. No. Because what's going to be is long-term, it's going to be a loss for you. Even if it works out like they say it's going to work out, it's going to be a loss for you. So look at them, from that perspective. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do that. And I prefer one that maybe a lot of people don't prefer. One way you can look at it is, okay, we're going to give them so much of our hard-earned tax money, we got to get that much tax money back over the years. That's one way to look at it. And a lot of communities do that, and that's fine. You get a rate of return on that, and that's well and good. The other way, which I like a little better, is what is it going to do for our community? It may be worth not getting back all the tax money if it's going to create a lot of new jobs and an industry going to create more opportunities and keep more people here and provide more educational things and build the community quality of life. Take a look at the bigger picture. If we invest, I'm going to pull a number out there, $5 million in incentives into something. If we invest $5 million in incentives into something, and we only think over 10 or 15 years, if we run the numbers, the government's going to get back $4 million, then ask the next question. What are you going to get for that other $1 million? And if the answer is not much, then don't do it. If the answer is, wow, man, this is an industry that has a lot of suppliers, a lot of other things going for it. It's a good, clean industry. They can train at the university. They'll be supporting a lot of things we're doing and say, wow, that's worth a lot more than $1 million, and do it. Very good example is the incentive package down in San Antonio for Toyota. Pretty big package when all was said and done. Took an act of Congress to get it through almost, or at least an act of the Texas legislature, but it was a pretty big incentive package. There are 212 suppliers to Toyota in the San Antonio area right now. Okay. When they just got the big Toyota headquarters in Plano that they're building now for North America, a lot of companies started moving a part of their headquarters there. They've already announced it, dozens of them, just because they want their managers close to Toyota's managers, and they're not even making anything there. That's just where they push the paper around. And they want to be close to the folks that push Toyota's paper around. And so, think about those things and look at those kinds of things. And those are all just things to consider, and hopefully some food for thought as you go into the economic development situation. In terms of your community and what's happening here, as you know, there are a lot of good things happening. There's a lot of good retail developments. You've had some new firms that make stuff come in recently, and that's all good. But if you look at the numbers over a long period of time, I mean, I don't like to talk about this stuff, but you know the picture as well as I do. The number of people working in Wichita Falls right now is just about the same as it was 20 years ago. It's just about the same. In fact, it's a little less. The population is just about the same. Tad more, but not much. And so, and if you look at the manufacturing employment, it's half what it was. And all that says is, it's time to take a look at stuff. And you've obviously reached the conclusion, it's time to take a look at stuff and see what we can figure out. Now, let me tell you, there are thousands of communities in the United States that I can make exactly those same statements about. Manufacturing's half what it used to be, not very little employment or population movement in the last couple of decades. That is not uncommon at all. You hear about the Friscos of the world. That Frisco had a population in the 1990 census of 6,000. Now it has a population of 160,000 or something. Those are the ones you hear about. They publish the list of the 10 fastest growing communities in the country and all that kind of stuff. People love those lists. But that's not the majority. And what made that happen are some specific things that aren't here. Namely, proximity to a very rapidly growing metropolitan area and a toll road that happened to go that direction. Okay? I mean, you take those two things away, and Frisco still grows a lot because of where it is, but it doesn't grow anywhere near. I mean, it's a town of 50,000, not a town of 160,000 without that toll road coming up there. And so, and they've done a lot of things right there. Very good programs, very innovative things. They've done a lot of good things, but even those opportunities wouldn't have been there in the absence of that toll road. You know, well, they don't need a toll road from Fort Worth to here. So, you know, that's, and if they did, it's a little bit too far to drive every day for most folks. So that's, you know, so don't think about that. You are centrally located. You're roughly halfway between the Metroplex and Oklahoma City. Two big, thriving, successful places. There's probably no, as far in terms of economic development, innovation, and that sort of thing, there's probably no better place around than Oklahoma City. And they've had 3 consecutive very good mayors over 20 years, and they have driven that thing and done a lot of wonderful stuff in Oklahoma City. Obviously, the Metroplex has grown a lot. So you're right in between 2 rapidly growing places. Problem is, you're not that close. And the community I spend most of my time in, I live in Odessa now because 25 years ago I married the mayor, but I still work in Waco. When you marry the mayor, you move. You just forget it. You know, David knows my wife. No way I wouldn't have moved to Odessa. But anyway, I work in Waco, and I've been helping Waco with economic development stuff recently and throughout the time I've lived there. And I remember going to a meeting in 1978, and the first statement that was made by one of the local leaders was, "We are halfway between Dallas and Austin. We're going to grow." And so, you know, young, stupid, innocent me, I said, "Well, how long have we been halfway between Dallas and Austin?" You know, and the answer was, a long time. But they were 100 miles from Austin, 100 miles from Dallas. You know, now that's kind of grown together over 40 years. It's grown together more, you know. But, and you're seeing that in the Metroplex too. I mean, Sherman's getting to be much more closer to the Metroplex than it used to be. You're getting a little closer than you used to be, but not at the pace it's going to cause a huge amount of growth in the next 3 or 4 years. So you know, you're halfway in between, and that's good. Number one, it gives you a big trade area because basically there's nothing else in between. And so that gives you a pretty good trade area where you're the closest place for folks to come into. And as a result of that, you have a pretty big area that you can draw people from, you can draw workers from, you can draw spenders from, and that's all good. And so that part of it's good. But it doesn't mean that when they put a big facility in Plano, you're going to get a piece of the action. Or when something big goes to Oklahoma City, you're going to get a piece of the action. It could happen, but it's not going to automatically happen. Because you're just not close enough in proximity for that to be the case. So you know, and I'm just telling you these things because this is just the reality of what you need to think about when you're thinking about this thing. Because the last thing in the world you want to do is do an economic development study and then come away from it saying, "Well, man, we're great. We don't need to change a thing." Unless you're happy with where it is. If I look at the numbers and I figure out you're paying somebody some money to do this, you're even paying me to talk to you today, then I figure, you know, you probably want to change something. You probably want things to be a little bit different. Your population is gradually getting a little bit older. It's not a bad thing necessarily. It's good for your healthcare industry. But what it also says is you're not retaining young people. And I think most people, the most compelling argument to me for economic development is man, I wish I was in a place where my kids and grandkids would be. And that's my most compelling, especially my 3 little grandboys. I really wish I was close to them. 2 of them are in Austin, 1 of them's in D.C., so I'm not doing very well. But you know, that we want our young people who have come through our public school systems, maybe been educated over at Midwestern, you want those folks to have opportunities to stay here. Not just because they want to. Some will stay because they want to, or some will stay because they're taking over a family business or something like that. But you want them to have opportunities that, man, when they come out of there, you know, that's great. Okay. Obviously, the military is a big part of your local economy here. And that, as you know, also is subject to fluctuations. And we don't really have a good read right now on what that's likely to be in the future. But it's a very good industry. They spend a lot of that. You know, they're steady. They pay their bills. And I think they'll still keep paying their bills after September. You know, we always have these debt ceiling fights, and they always fuss around and fume around, and they always call folks like me in the press and say, what's going to happen, what's going to happen? I say, at the end of the day, they're going to put a deal together because they don't have any choice. And that's what's going to happen this time. You know, they'll put some, it may be a patch, it may be a real deal, but they won't shut the government down, or they may shut the government down for a few days. They won't not pay their bills. And they're not going to shut down Air Force bases. When they say shut the government down, they don't mean Air Force bases. They mean stuff that makes you really mad, so you will call your congressman. You know, and that's one of the differences in government and private sector. If you're having difficulty in your business in the private sector, you don't want your customers to know it. You do everything you can, man, to keep that customer service high and keep things going and squeeze through that tough time. Government, you know, when they say we want to shut the government down, man, the first thing they do is they close the national parks. They start messing with the Social Security checks. Because what they want is they want people to get mad and call and say, you get to call your congressman and say, get this thing fixed. You know? And so it's just the opposite. They try to make it very visible, whereas a company tries to make it very invisible. And that's just the nature of the game and the process and how they get their money. But anyway, all that to say, you know, the military is a very good industry. You are subject to, it's one of those kind of hit or miss things. More than likely, I mean, it's been around a long time, but you know, there have been a lot of places that have endured base closures in the last 25 or 30 years. There's another base closure commission going on right now. The way we train and think about the military is changing. Technology is changing the military. And I don't see anything out there. I'm not saying that's a threat or risk or anything right now. But I'm just saying that, you know, that's one of those things you need to think about as you think about economic development is beyond that, because Shepherd's been very, very good to this community for a long time. I think there will be some opportunities in oil and gas. And you still have some of it around here. But I don't think they're going to be huge job generators. Here's what you find in today's age, and I think this was part of the last election cycle, but it's very relevant to Wichita Falls. I mentioned that your manufacturing output, that your manufacturing employment's about half what it was. And a lot of plants have closed and shut down, that sort of thing. Your manufacturing output is about the same. Now, how can that be? Every worker generates more value added than they used to. And that's the nature of modern manufacturing. The jobs that created the anger in the last election in the Midwest and other places, basically what happened was people got more productive. And it wasn't so much that jobs went overseas, it's that jobs that job doesn't exist anymore. They don't do it that way anymore. The biggest example we see of it in Texas is down on the Gulf Coast. There are projects right now where they're spending $10 billion on a refinery upgrade, and they'll add 50 jobs. There was a time when you spent $10 billion, you would employ thousands of people. But most of it is automated now. You have entire refinery shifts now run with 5 people, pretty good sized refineries. I mean, it's just a different world than we used to live in. And what you can do one of two things. You can say, we don't like that, let's try to fight it. Or you can adapt. Kind of like getting to the top of an oak tree. You can climb it or you can sit on an acorn. There's 2 ways to get there. You know, one of them just takes a little longer. And so, you know, basically what I'm trying to say is to talk about what it used to be is nice and it's pleasant and you think, gee, wouldn't it be nice if it's not going to happen. So when you're thinking about the future, don't think about we need to get back those manufacturing jobs we lost. If you get back manufacturing jobs, that's a good thing, but you won't get back those jobs. You'll get back very different jobs with very different skill sets and very different education needs and a lot more dollars in the ground and capital per worker than it used to take. So it's a very different kind of thing. The other thing, when you're thinking about those things, think about how many capital dollars are going in the ground, even if you give them a tax abatement for a few years. Think about how many dollars are going in the ground, because that's important. Because dollars in the ground bring staying power. And you've had some success here with the call centers, and they're great. They create a lot of jobs, particularly good for folks who maybe don't have quite as many skills as some other folks, and it's a very good thing. But it's also very easy to move, because typically they go into an old abandoned building that used to be a superstore or something, and they don't spend a lot on capital, and it's very easy to relocate those things, and so you don't get as much staying power. Now again, there are times when it's good. You also have to think about in other sectors. There's a lot of controversy these days of whether or not to incentivize retail. It used to be very simple. The answer was no. Okay? You didn't incentivize retail because if you get everything else, retail comes. Retail comes to serve the people that are there. Nobody's going to build a store because you give them an incentive. You're going to give a store because people are going to buy something at the store. You can't pay them enough to build a store, nobody's going to come in. So you don't do retail. But then retail changed. And retail became a destination industry in some cases. The single biggest tourist attraction in the state of Texas, not surprisingly, is the Alamo. We expect it to be. The second biggest tourist attraction in the state of Texas is the Outlet Mall in San Marcos. Okay? There are 5 states in which the single biggest tourist attraction that draws the most visitors from out of state is Cabela's. There are 5 states in this country where Cabela's is the single biggest tourist attraction in the state. Now, think about that. That kind of retail is they're bringing money from the outside and spending it in your community. That's exactly what manufacturing does. That's why tourism is a good thing. If you have some things you promote in terms of tourism, and you've made some investments in that arena here as well. That's the thing about tourism, makes it a good industry. They bring the money in from the outside and they spend it here. And it circulates through your community and supports your workforce and your employees and your public services and that sort of thing. and so there are times when it makes sense to do something with retail. And it's a function of the size of your community. You are in the center of a big trade area. Therefore, there are times where a particular type of location of a particular type of retail might bring more people here that would otherwise go to Oklahoma City. And that might not be the same thing that it would take to be a major retail destination center in the Metroplex. Because there's so many people up there that are going to go, there's 8 and 9 million people up there that are going to go there anyway. So, but those are the kind of things where I say it's an individual analysis of each situation, looking at it. A lot of people want to get an easy formula, X dollars per job. Well, is that a $10 an hour job or a $50 an hour job? That makes a difference. And those are just the kind of things that as you're doing it, you need to think about them. And I think your community has a lot of opportunities. I mean, you're in a state that, despite our efforts in Austin to screw it up sometimes, we're in a state that has a good cost of living, a good regulatory environment, a good tax environment, a good framework for incentives and competing and that sort of thing. We generally lead the country in new plant locations every year and win the Governor's Cup by a wide margin. Usually about 200 or 300 plants. I mean, we wipe the floor with everybody else. So it's a very, very good environment in which to be. You got a good climate. You got some pretty stuff around here. So that you've got a great university, and that's a huge asset to have university and community college in a community this size. To have resources of that size is a great asset for the area because the workforce is going to be the currency of the future in terms of economic development. So that's a great part of it. So there's a whole lot of very positive things here, and absolutely no reason at all this community can't grow and redefine itself and that sort of thing. All I'm trying to do here is point out some of the don't do this, don't do that. Don't think so much about the past. Don't worry about sunk cost if you're an accountant. It's sunk, okay? And look forward to what's the world going to look like in the future. There's going to be manufacturing. The U.S. will set an all-time record this year in manufacturing output. We'll do it with several million fewer manufacturing workers than we had 20 years ago. Well, was that an all-time record? People say we're not a manufacturing country. We make more stuff than we ever did. We just make it with fewer workers. We haven't deindustrialized America. We've deindustrialized American labor. Because we make the stuff at the upper end of the food chain. And that requires skilled people. You have some great engineering programs here at the university and other things that can help provide some of those people, support those resources. You have a nice environment. One of the other things that's changed a lot is there are a lot of companies now where location, in terms of physical location, just doesn't matter. And that can work to your advantage because a whole lot of companies now pretty much do it all online. Or they develop software that's going to be used anywhere and they can upload it any place in the world. And what that says is you can train the engineers here And you can create a nice environment for them to work in, and they can like it here, and it's more and have more space and a good quality of life for their families. And you can get some of those folks. Some of those smaller technology companies can come here. When I said before, don't try to compete, don't try to be Austin, that means you're not going to get the one that needs 5,000 engineers. They're not coming here. But the one that needs 15 or 20 really good ones might come here. And so, again, just thinking about your community in terms of what it could be in light of what the world is and is becoming. That's what I'm talking about. Healthcare is an enormous opportunity. As David well knows, one of the hats his dad and I shared at one point in time is serving together on the board of first Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas and later Healthcare Service Corporation in Chicago. And so I can tell you all about there's a lot of uncertainty in healthcare right now. And we're dealing with some major issues in healthcare right now. But there's a common denominator through all of it. The industry keeps growing. We're fussing about exchanges and what we're going to do with Medicaid and all this, and they're very, very important issues. They all need to be dealt with. But the bottom line is, through all of it, the industry keeps growing and growing and growing. If you go back to 2008, we're in the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression, and you'd go down and look at every, those months the economy lost 700,000-800,000 jobs. You went and looked down the industry list, it was like down, 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 up, down, 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 down. The up was healthcare. And it's growing for several reasons. One is we're getting older. Older folks need more healthcare. The other demographic group that's growing is kids. Kids use a lot of healthcare. People between 20 and 65 or so don't use much healthcare in the aggregate per capita. Because you get past all the stupid teenage stuff and all the childhood illnesses and all that kind of stuff that can happen. And then it's usually when you're older, you tend to have some complications and things. But in between, not so much for most people. There are exceptions, but for most people, not so much. Well, those demographics are the two that are growing right now, particularly the aging population. As a society and as a state, we're getting fatter. And that creates a lot of health issues. And also, we're getting browner, which is a higher incidence of diabetes and a lot of other things are just more expensive in the healthcare system. So the healthcare system's growing for one reason because there's so much demand. We're also getting so much better at it. New things we can do and new treatments and new formulas and that sort of thing. So the bottom line is we're going to fuss around and do a lot of things about how we pay for it for a while here. But throughout that process, the sector is going to be a growing sector because all the forces that make it grow are out there. And so you have a great base here to do that from. Not only the hospital system, but a lot of other health-related facilities around here that give you a very strong base for that. And that can also lead into some biosciences. Tyler's done a very good job of leveraging some of that. Temple's done a very good job of leveraging some of that. You have some similar characteristics here to do some of those things as well. So there's a lot of opportunities here, and I think there's every reason to be very optimistic about the future and feel very good about your community and where you can go. But I mean, you have to, as a practical matter, as you go into this process, you have to realize we hadn't grown jobs in 20 years, we hadn't grown people in 20 years. We probably want to do something a little different than we've been doing it before. And we want to look at the world a little bit differently than we've looked at it before. And hopefully I've helped you do some of that a little bit today. Let me stop there and just take questions. And don't feel restricted to what I've just talked about. We can talk about anything you want to. I mean, this community has a long history. I mean, if you write the history of Texas, it's cattle, cotton, and oil up until about 25 years ago. And if you write the history of this area, I mean, there's a lot, you've got a lot going on. But so we can talk about anything nationally, anything state, anything going on in Austin, Washington, because we're involved in way too much of it, I can assure you. And or anything about economic development or about your area, and I'd be happy to talk about it as much as you want to. This is your time, but I wanted to try to kind of set the framework and hopefully give you some things to think about. So as you go into next week, you're kind of go into it with some thoughts, and you're kind of framing yourself for the next week or so as you think about your community in the future and that sort of thing. Yes, sir.
Would you please index the importance of a viable downtown for our community in regards to industrial development?
Okay, absolutely. That's a very good question. Importance of a viable downtown. That is becoming increasingly important and an increasingly important source of competitive advantage for communities. And as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of communities are doing a lot of things pretty successfully these days to start to revitalize their downtowns. And part of that is, again, dealing with the demographics. Right now, a lot of people in the newer generations. I was telling him before we started here today. My employee base is about half people who've been with me 25 or 30 years, about half millennials, and it's a very different ball game. But one of the things they like is living in an urban space, living downtown. You know, and for them to do that, there has to be activity downtown and things to do downtown. And so, and you know, one of the big things as you look at the future, even in what you might think of as hard manufacturing industries, again, most of those jobs now are pretty technical, sophisticated jobs. And the most important thing in all of those jobs these days is your human resource. It's your physical capital. You know, it's can they do the things we need them to do? You got to keep and retain those people, and a lot of those people like a vibrant downtown. And so it is a very important part of the process, and there are a number of communities all over Texas that are going through that process right now. I know y'all are having some discussions about it here, and there's a number of communities in Texas, and a number of communities all over the country. There's some great success stories. I mean, Oklahoma City, right up the road, is a great success story. Fort Worth, right down the road, is a great, or across, I guess, a little bit and down, is a great success story. I mean, there's a lot, but even among communities around this size, there's a lot of communities that have done a very good job of that, and I do think it's a very important part of what you do. Again, like anything else, if you're looking at incentive packages, and I know a little bit about your deal. I was asked to look at it at one point briefly, and you know, that sort of thing is, again, you just evaluate it and see if it makes sense to do it that way or a different way. But revitalizing downtowns can be a very important competitive advantage for the kinds of industry I think you'll find yourself wanting to attract and able to attract and that sort of thing.
Next week, we'll cut the ribbon on a new career technological education facility. That's a big achievement for our community, but at some point in time, I worry that you can't keep turning to the government, the taxing entities, to provide the next thing. It comes back to philanthropy and personal household decisions. And relative to thinking about, maybe it's Angelo State, where kids can go to Angelo State for a lower cost because of philanthropic contributions.
Right.
I just wonder, what are your thoughts on whether it's philanthropic decisions to support trying to make all of our elementary schools and other and secondary education exemplary, if that would be a draw to our community, and to continue to support scholarship privately as opposed to waiting on the next 4A, 4B project, or waiting on the next the taxing entity to support something like the career technical education.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think you could hear him. It basically asked about philanthropy versus public support for education and other things. And obviously the career centers is a very important thing and can pay very good dividends. The key thing is to make sure you're matching the careers to what the opportunities are likely to be, you know, because there's a real tendency to do what you've always done or something like that. But those have been very successful in a lot of communities. Now, I think the philanthropy piece of it is very important, because the bottom line is, if you stop and look at it right now, the fundamental problem we have in Austin is, you know, when you strip away everything else, Texas is gaining 1,200 people a day. That's several hundred kids in our school systems. That's several hundred cars and trucks on our roadways. And we have a growing economy. And there's all kinds of needs out there. And we have a tax system in Texas that's not going to grow that fast. And it's just because structurally it's a long history behind it. It's a lot of evolution. And it's very difficult to change those things. A gentleman you and I both knew well, Bob Bullock, used to say the only good tax is an old tax, you know, because people don't like the new ones. And so it's unlikely we're going to do any massive changes. So we're going to be strapped fiscally for a long time. If you look at Washington, okay, if you look at Washington, the bottom line issue is every time they spend $1, they take in 66 cents. We like a lot of stuff they do for us, but we don't want to pay for it. And they're the only entity in this country that can print money without going to prison. And so they can get by with that for a while. And they've been getting by with it for a while. But it creates a situation where they can't come in and do all this stuff, and nor do we want them to come in and do some things. One of the tricks that both the Washington plays and Austin plays is we'll just dump it down on the local governments. And so all of a sudden there's a big hue and cry across the country. I'm sure some of it right here across the state. Our property taxes are too high. And the state's saying, we got to do something about that. Well, one reason they're too high is the state took away a lot of stuff they used to pay for. They used to pay for 60% of the schools, now they pay for 30% of the schools. Well, got to make it up somewhere. So all that to say, it's very unlikely the public sector is going to be able to meet the needs that we have traditionally called public goods in the way we want them to in the future, which brings up exactly what David is saying. There is a real advantage to philanthropy. I don't know what your situation is here. I know, I'll just use Odessa as an example because I know it very well. About 15, 20 years ago, my wife started an education foundation out there. And it started out as a very small effort to raise a few $100,000 to supplement programs in the public schools. And now it's grown to a program where they feed most of the hungry kids in the schools. They provide a lot of scholarships to the community college and the university that are out there, and that sort of thing. And those kinds of efforts I think are very, very important because it is going to take communities investing in themselves voluntarily to do that. And you do have some people with resources around here. You have some history that's generated some resources around here. And to involve some of that, I think is very critical. And it's going to definitely take that. I don't think, whether it's infrastructure or anything else, you're going to be able to automatically assume that government's going to provide what you need in the future, nor should we make that assumption. So I do think that's a very, very important part of it, and probably nowhere does it come into play more than education, investing in your public school systems, investing in your higher education facilities and that sort of thing through a philanthropic process is, I think, very good and very important and indeed essential. Absolutely.
Yes, a lot of communities are reevaluating, in particular the communities that have both the 4A and 4B sales tax operation. They're reevaluating whether or not to target the eventual incentive money to traditional primary job manufacturing targets or quality of life improvements, whether it's downtown improvements, whether it's school improvements, things that will help retain and grow your workforce and make your community more attractive where people would want to locate and live and raise a family. What is your philosophy on that? And maybe the best answer, the easiest answer, is you got to do both. That's an easy answer. But there are communities that are considering, do we need a 4A or should it all be 4B or should we just have a 4A? And maybe our incentive money, because it's finite. Right here in Wichita Falls, we raise about $3.6 million in each 4A and 4B each year. Should we, communities are asking themselves, should we target that money away from the traditional old style incentives to the new stuff? What's your thought on that?
A good question, and it has to do with the 4A and 4B sales tax, and should you be thinking about changing your structure and what you do with it and that sort of thing. And a lot of communities, as you say, are going through that process right now. There's a long history behind all that. At first there wasn't 4A and 4B, there was only 4 because there wasn't an A and a B. And that was the Texas Economic Development Act that passed back in, I think, 1989 or so, that let communities impose a sales tax for economic development through an election. And for a while, it was the criteria were somewhat loose. And I'm just brief history here. And the reason why 4A is fairly restrictive right now, I guess you can blame me for part of that. We kind of had an economic slowdown in the 90s at one point in Texas. And a lot of communities decided that putting a new roof on a fire station was economic development and that sort of thing. And we had a lieutenant governor, a gentleman from Mount Pleasant that some of you probably know, that wasn't too happy about that. And he called me one day and he said, one of two things is going to happen tomorrow. This thing's going away, or you'll give me a list of industries that are primary. And so on one night stand, I made a list, and that became the 4A list. So you can blame me for that. And then later, when some communities want to do other things, particularly when Senator Brymer, who used to represent the Fort Worth area, when they wanted to build the first stadium out there, wanted to use some resources, that's when 4B came about. So there's a long legislative history of how all these things came about. And 4B, for those of you that don't know this stuff, you probably do, but 4A is more focused on primary jobs, manufacturing, distribution, that type of thing. 4B gives you a little more flexibility in terms of investing in quality of life projects and tourism-based projects and that kind of thing. And there's room for both. And I would discourage you from 4B actually gives you a little more flexibility on the whole than 4A does because of how they evolved over time. But in any case, I would say don't ever abandon the incentive process. because there are times, as I said earlier, you're going to need that. But as I said earlier, economic development and how we define growth is changing. And that's what you have to look forward to. When I first started doing this, and I go back a long way, I'm in my 40th year now, okay? I started very, 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 very young, just a little baby. But anyway, I'm in my 40th year of doing this now. So when I first started, here's what economic development was. There were no incentives, there weren't any of that kind of stuff. I mean, you could give tax abatements and stuff locally, but there wasn't any state incentives, anything like that. Utilities and railroads. Because back then we had monopoly railroads and monopoly utilities. And primarily utilities by the time I got into it. And every utility, back in those days, the old Texas Power and Light and all those old ones that they used to have, they all had in every town, they had an economic development person in every town. They had like a community representative in every town. And they, and they promoted everything. Well then, and also in their offices in Dallas, they had a huge economic development department, lots of folks. And they would go out and they would find manufacturers that might want to come to Texas, and they would take them to 5 or 6 of their communities. Show them around, do the dog and pony shows, all that kind of stuff, and try to sell them. And they really didn't care which one they picked because they were a monopoly. They wanted to peddle the juice. And wherever you landed, you had to buy the juice from them. Same thing with the railroad. They'd take them to places along their route, and if they would place things that needed rail, if you went on that route, you're going to use their railroad. Well, then we deregulated all that stuff. Those things went away, and it became a more locally oriented process, and more like you see today. And so it's evolved over time. But with that, the basic industry definition has changed. I mean, people say all the time, look at all these service jobs in the United States. Isn't that terrible? 70% of our jobs are service jobs. Would you like to know that we have a huge trade surplus in services? Everybody talks about our trade deficit. We have a trade deficit overall when you add up manufacturing and services, but it's because manufacturing is negative and trade and services is very positive. Because think about it. There are accounting firms that do accounting work all over the world. There are architectural firms that do architectural work all over the world. Because if you've got a computer and a CAD system, you don't have to be physically there to do the work. There are engineering firms. There are stupid economists. I mean, there are all kind of service people who do work all over. There's now remote delivery of health care all over the place. There's all kinds of things that have changed. And services doesn't mean, a lot of people have these two words confused. Services, hamburger flipper. Because you'll hear people, we don't want any more of those hamburger flipper jobs. Well, first of all, somebody's got to flip them. But aside from that, services are, a lot of services are very high value added jobs. I mean, it's doctors, lawyers, accountants, architects, engineers. Those are all service jobs. Probably the majority of you in this room probably work in the service sector. And I would say the majority of you don't consider yourselves to be low wage workers. And that's just a fact of a fact of life and where we are these days. So we have to look at the world differently. Those are also very good jobs that are not necessarily place bound. And so you need a little more flexibility than we used to have, and 4B does give you more flexibility. Now again, I would not abandon the ability to do incentives for projects, but you have to recognize that's not the same game that it was. As I was talking about earlier, retail, at times, retail is economic development. I mean, getting the next chain restaurant to come in, no. But getting something to come in that draws people into your community that wouldn't come otherwise. Like I say, the second biggest tourist attraction in the second biggest state in the country is an outlet mall in San Marcos. So, I mean, there's plenty of opportunities for retail to constitute economic development. And so all of that has changed. And with that comes the emphasis on parks and quality of life and that sort of thing. And also the emphasis on workers being the most important thing in the future. Workers are no longer fungible, interchangeable folks. And I think, again, that's some of the anger that popped up in this last election. It was that you had to have some very, very highly skilled people these days to work in the same industries you used to work in. If we were to suddenly get back the entire auto industry that was lost in the Midwest, you wouldn't get back all those old guys on assembly lines doing stuff. Robots do that stuff now. You'd get a different class of workers. We completely lost the apparel industry in the United States, except for very few companies that market themselves as made in the USA. but very, very little apparel intake. There used to be apparel all over the place. There used to be apparel all around here. Down the valley, a ton of apparel. All that's gone. I think we'll get it back in the next 10 years, but it'll be robots, not hundreds of people behind sewing machines working. You know, it's just a different world. We live in a different place, and again, we can be nostalgic about it. And that's fine, you know. Or we can look forward and say, what do we want to do to capture the next one? And 4B can be an important part of the asset base to do that. And I think you're fortunate here to have both. But I think a very valid part of your evaluation of yourself going forward is how you want to try to allocate those resources. Keep in mind, you do have to elect to drop one and add the other one. There's some dynamics of the election process that takes place there too. But I do think that's a very valid part of the conversation to have, no question. Or somebody, yes, sir.
When we start our budget process at the county every year, we get into pretty long general economic discussions about where we are and what's our tax base look like and how it's growing. And when we did that this year, we began to take a look at who are the employers here in the county, in the city.
Right.
And what we found was, if you go look at the list, that in the top 10 of the biggest employers in this area, the overwhelming majority of those are governmental agencies.
No question, I looked at it last night.
Now, my question is, and I think this ties a little bit in what David was talking about a while ago, are we unique in that in this community? Are we out of sync? Is our ratio different? And does that create a challenge for us, a specific challenge?
You're not unique at all. I guess, you know, the one sense in which you're a little unique is Shepherd is so big relative to everything else. But putting that aside, in fact, you know, the fact that it's going to be your school district, your hospital district, I mean, you know, your county, your city, if you have a public university, a public university, I mean, that's not unusual at all. That's very, very common in cities in this size range. When you get up into cities, even when you get into cities of several million people, sometimes the public employers are the largest because the public sector grows along with the private sector. And we have had a tendency for that to edge up over time as well. Now here, your government employment's been fairly stable. I mean, it's up a little bit over the last few years, but it's fairly stable. But there's been a tendency over time for public sector employment to grow, almost irrespective of economic conditions. And that's been, you know, and as I say, the public sector faces a real challenge right now. I mean, I don't have to tell you that if you're budgeting for the county. I mean, public sector faces a very steep challenge right now at the local level. And frankly, I don't think it's going to get any easier anytime soon. And I do think, you know, one part of the solution is supplementing that with the philanthropy efforts. Those of us that live in Odessa are always very jealous of the folks who live in Midland. You know, the poor people live in Odessa and the rich people live in Midland. But you know, they have an extreme case in that there's so much oil wealth there that, and there's about 20 very large family foundations there. I mean, literally, they just underwrite everything. You know, it's like during the oil bust or the oil boom, housing got so expensive they were having a hard time getting teachers. Well, the foundation just gave them money to put all the teachers in the housing. You know, I mean, and so I mean that's an extreme case, and you can't obviously reproduce that everywhere. But I do think it's a very important that philanthropy is going to have to be a piece of it. Now, unfortunately, the math doesn't work for it to be the dominant piece of it. I mean, if we go back now, I mean, there was a point in time in our history, you know, when people kind of took care of each other and there wasn't much government structure at all. And a lot of people lived in rural areas with no government to speak of, and managed to help out each other and do okay. And we have long passed that where those ratios work. I mean, philanthropy in this country is in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and governments are in the tens of trillions of dollars. So I mean, you're talking orders of magnitude of difference. But it is an area in which there's some, you know, I think there's some real opportunities, particularly when you focus on something like education, which I think probably the most logical place to focus it. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
So the decline of the skilled workforce is a national issue.
Let me get a little closer.
Sorry. I could be louder.
Okay, either way, good work.
The decline of the skilled workforce is a national issue, and there's countless ways that communities can combat that. Have you seen any communities that have stood out as innovative in combating that?
Okay, good question. The decline of the skilled workforce and communities that have been successful in dealing with that. First of all, again, when you get you have to think about the old world and the new world. There's not really a decline in the skilled workforce. The skill set has changed. Okay, what used to be the definition of the skilled workforce was folks who could do something in a factory, had some kind of skill that could do something in a factory. That's not the skilled workforce anymore. A lot of people want it to be the skilled workforce. And I think that's a lot of what the anger that fueled a lot of things recently in our economy and in our policies, and our elections and other things. Is a lot of people like that to be, but the skill set itself has changed. There are communities that have done a pretty good job. Waco is a good example. Waco's done a very good job of kind of matching skill sets to their workforce. They're doing a pretty good job down in South Houston, the Fort Bend County area, of doing that. So there are some, there are some examples of that. You have a very good situation here with a university and a community college, and I understand you got the new facility that David was talking about. I mean, you're doing all the things that can make that happen. The key thing is in those is to match the skill sets to the needs, and there's a real inertia can be a bad thing sometimes, and I mean, you certainly wouldn't do this here, but I remember years ago when the state first put together their state employment workforce matching system, and I'd helped build it, and they asked me to run this commission to evaluate it and look at it and that sort of thing, and I went to 2 meetings and I quit. And the reason I quit was, at that point in time they had a lot of resources. As you know, Future Farmers of America used to have tons of resources all over the state. I mean, they had big programs and lots of infrastructure in just about every school in the world, and they were training enough farmers to serve in any given graduating class to serve the needs of Texas for the next 600 years. And yet, because that's what they had, and that's what they did, they wanted that to be defined as a priority occupation. And we got into this deal of you can't say, well, this is what we want it to be. And again, we're way past the point that would be an issue. But the point is, you have to make sure you're training for the skills that are going to be in demand, and be flexible with that. Work with industry. Go back and forth with industry. The better programs tend to do that. Go back and forth and see what industry needs. Oftentimes, the industry will subsidize it at a university or a community college or something like that. If they need a training program, that they'll often help subsidize that program if it provides the workers they need. So those opportunities are there. But Waco and then the Fort Bend County area down south, kind of a little bit south of Houston, those are a couple of areas that have done pretty well with it.
Could you briefly comment about Chairman Yellen and the committee divesting themselves of their portfolio and what effects you think that might have on the national economy?
Which remark by Chairman Yellen? Which remark did you talk about by Chairman Yellen? What you're talking about at the Fed? Yeah. Okay. The process of bringing down their balance sheet? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah, they pretty much have to do that, and it will cause interest rates to go up a little bit as they do it probably. But they pretty much have to. Here's what happened with that. If you look at economy, roughly $20 trillion economy like the U.S. has right now. If you look at that, and you look at our monetary system and how sophisticated it is, you say, how much cash should it take to run that economy? The answer is about $1 trillion. We need about 5%. Okay, and I'm rounding off here, but that's pretty close. Okay, so the Fed's balance sheet in terms of assets, which is the bonds which put the money in circulation, should be about $1 trillion. It's about $4.5 trillion right now. So it's way, way, way out of balance. And it's out of balance for 2 reasons, one of which was absolutely essential, one of which you could debate. Back in 2008, when the world was about to collapse, one of my many hats, I've got a lot of hats. When I was a baby economist, I wrote my dissertation on Federal Reserve policy and created some of the indices that the Fed and 64 other central banks in the world use. And so I'm regularly in contact and part of an advisory group for the last 35 years or more. And so I'm on the phone with these guys all the time. They don't work and play well with others, by the way. But in any case, at that point in time, and this is way inside baseball, but the Treasury bill rate and the London interbank rate usually are very, very close together. One's our federal government rate, which is risk-free. The other one is the rate at which banks lend money to other banks short-term, secured by government security. So it's very, very low risk, but so it's a little bit higher than our rate. Usually, the spread is usually about 1 or 2% difference. Percent, not percentage points. Percent. Like If ours is, if it's 1%, it'll be 1.01. You know, that very, very close together. They were apart by a factor of 550, which basically meant banks were going to stop loaning to each other, which meant the financial system was going to shut down. To stop that, the Fed and some other central banks poured a couple of $1 trillion in very fast, and that was half of the problem. Okay, they had to do it. They had no choice. I mean, you can go back and say, well, the world didn't collapse, so why did they do it? Well, if they hadn't done it, the world would have collapsed. And you have that argument all day, but I was in the room. That's true. The next piece of it, though, is where it gets a little bit trickier. After that, as you know, the economy was really slow, and you had a massive recession and a slow recovery. Congress couldn't get their act together to do anything, and the Fed's kind of in that position where they can ask forgiveness instead of permission to do something. And so that's when they started quantitative easing 1 and 2 and 3 and all that stuff, which was basically just pumping more money in the system, okay? And that was where the other couple of trillion came from. And you could argue whether or not that was a good policy or not. I would say balancing the scales a little bit on the positive side, but you know, you make a good case for the other side too. But so bottom line is now that we've been growing for a while, they've got to get that back in shape. So they have to do that. They have to but the key is it's kind of a Goldilocks thing. They got to do it just right. If they bring it down too fast, they'll raise interest rates too much, knock the economy off course. If they don't bring it down fast enough, inflation will go up, which will kick up high long-term interest rates and drive the economy in the tank. So it's a balancing act, and they'll probably do it pretty well. I mean, they're good at this. They've been doing this is what they know how to do. They're pretty good at this. But no, I think it is the proper time to start looking at that. And it's remarkable we went 10 years without looking at it. But so I think it's the right policy. But it's going to tick interest rates up some, no question. Anything else? Okay, well, I hope I've helped you, and I hope you have a very, very good sessions with your consultants, and I hope you get a very good plan and do what you can. Let me close with one quick thought here. With all the nice things that Henry said about me at the beginning, I'd like to close with a quote from Shakespeare, but I can't, okay, because I don't know very many. But as I mentioned, I grew up in Lindale. I work in Waco, and it's often said that Waco's not like yogurt because yogurt has live culture. But okay, I'm going to tell one other story. This wasn't the one I was going to tell, but that reminded me of another one. Years ago, I was speaking at the Texas Municipal League Conference, which is mayors and city managers and all that. And a big conference in Corpus Christi, several thousand people there. And I was in their convention center, and the lights were so bright. I mean, I couldn't see you. I mean, the lights just right in your face. So I had no idea who was in the audience. And I made that remark about Waco. And so the next day I was in town, some folks came down, one made an appointment to come see me. They came in, they were walking in the hallway giving me, and bring me a present. And it was this nice box with balloons and flowers and streamers and all kinds of stuff in it. And it turned out it was the Waco Convention and Visitors Bureau. And what they were bringing was a yogurt box stuffed with brochures about culture in Waco. So I guess if you're going through Waco, you should stop because there's culture, but it all fits in one box with room left over for flowers and balloons and streamers. Of course, now you can go to the silos, so now there's something to see. But talk about something changing the community. I keep getting off my story here, but Waco now gets 20,000 visitors a week because of that show, because of Fixer Upper. I mean, the occupancy tax is 4 times what it was. It's crazy. But anyway, so for what it's worth. And that's one of those random things that happens. Anyway, I'm going to close with a quote from Orson Welles. And he was a writer, director, actor. He did a lot of cool stuff. He did Citizen Kane, which most people say is the best movie that was ever made. He did War of the Worlds on the radio. He convinced my grandmother and other folks that Martians had landed in New Jersey. But what I remember about him, that was all before I came along, very late in his life, he did a commercial for Paul Masson wines. And it was probably the best commercial in history. It had a $15,000 budget. It was a 10-second commercial. And it ran forever. I mean, I literally, the other day, I spoke about 5-6 months ago, I spoke to some high school kids. And Orson Welles died in 1986, so way before these kids were born. Okay? And so I asked them, how many of you have heard of this commercial? Well, they'd heard of it because it's on Nick at Night or something. You know, and they all knew this commercial. And it was this very simple commercial. And he had this wonderful, deep, resonant voice. You know, and he would say, at Paul Masson, we will sell no wine. Yeah, before it's time. Everybody remembers this commercial. I mean, you don't remember those multi-bajillion-dollar Super Bowl commercials from 3 months ago, but you remember this. Okay? I mean, it's amazing what this thing does, how this commercial's lasted. We will sell no wine before it's time. That commercial has always bothered me because Paul Masson sells for $3.75 a gallon. And that's in a restaurant, you know, I mean, you know, but they get that stuff in a bottle, it's time. You know, Tuesday was a good year. But, and I say that only to say that you do have a great community here. You have a lot of advantages, locational, history, amenities, manufacturing base, all sorts of things. You have a lot of things going on here. You're taking those positive, proactive steps to help yourself define a future that you can that can preserve what's great about the place and help you grow and prosper in the future. So I think you have your stuff in a bottle, and I think it's time. Thank you very much.